Welcome everyone. Wendy Ramson from the Michigan Association of Planning. It's great to see you here with my colleague Leah Dumochel. A couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to Rhonda Wychuk. For this session, please stay muted. We've got a lot of people, so if you have a question along the way, put it in the chat box and we will pick that up at the appropriate time. You can also raise your hand and we'll try to recognize that as well. Also, I wanted to let you know that we've enabled the closed captioning, so you can go to the little CC box down in your menu bar and either turn that on or off, depending on whether it's helpful for you. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rhonda Wychuk from the Michigan Coastal Management Program. It's all yours, Rhonda.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us today. Very excited to be here in collaboration with the Michigan Association of Planning to provide this this summit to you. This is part of our collaboration in building a technical platform called the Coastal Leadership Academy. So we are approximately close to about 75 touches with folks that have attended our technical training. So we're very, very excited that you have chosen to be with us this afternoon. We're very excited to bring the summit with our very renowned speakers, and I'm going to ask them all to pop on for a moment. I'm going to first introduce the 4 speakers, and then we're going to get right into it because that's what you're here to hear. So we are first going to start off with Dr. Drew Grunwald. He's associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Environment and Sustainability, and he is an expert in so many different things, I am sure, Drew. But for today, he is a hydrologic modeling and water quality dynamics in coastal areas. I first met Drew actually as his position in NOAA. That's our coastal management program federal funder. So we've gone back a few years. So welcome, Drew. And then we're going to kick it off with Dr. Guy Meadows. He's been a long-term partner with the Coastal Management Program in EGLE. He's the director of Michigan, I can't say it out loud because I always say MTU, for tech, the Marine Engineering and Laboratory, and he's a leader, oh my goodness, historically in the research of environmental and sound engineering. He's just our really go-to guy on most things when we're talking about coastal processes. He will be followed by Dr. Ethan Teacoff. He is associate professor at MSU. He has been, we are wonderfully a transplant into Michigan, and we can't be more excited to have be working with him. He is working with us right now in the coastal program on a nearshore sediment transport study, and we are 6 to 8 or 10 sites, Ethan, I believe, as far as really trying to find out how the nearshore sediment movement is really occurring, and especially produced after storms. And then finally, we are going to be hearing for Dr. Richard Norton, and he is the professor at University of Michigan's the Urban and Regional Planning at Trarbonne College. And he is an expert. Yes, sorry, I always said that wrong. I always say he's a very complex individual because he is a planner and an attorney. So I guess internally he's always fighting himself. But he is going to be talking to us about the coastal areas, the management and planning and zoning and the legal aspects thereof. So very excited to turn this over to kick it off with Drew. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rhonda. And just with a head nod to Rhonda, can you hear me and see me okay with a quick sound check?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here. It really is an honor to be spending part of the afternoon with all of you and also be alongside such great colleagues to share this presentation. So again, my name is Drew Grunwald. I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability. And today my talk is going to be broken up into 4 brief parts. First, I want to give you a little bit of background and context for what it means from a hydrological process and even a climate perspective to try to understand water level variability on the Great Lakes, and not just to monitor it, but to represent water levels in long-term forecasting models. It's a major challenge. Second, I want to take a snapshot look at historical water levels, so we're all aware of what the historical water level record entails and what we might be able to learn from it. And then I want to dive a little bit into our understanding of what makes water levels go up and down through our understanding of the water balance. And then I'll finish off with just a few brief perspectives on long-term water level forecasts. But before I go any further, I do need to make sure I thank some sponsors and some individuals. First off, the team that I have here at the University of Michigan, just a wonderful group of postdoctorate fellows in the top row there, graduate students in the middle row, and then we're very fortunate to have talented undergraduates here as well on our team. All of them, without their help and their contribution, really none of the data and the slides that I'm showing would have been possible. I also want to thank a lot of my former colleagues at NOAA, at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, in particular those based in the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, as well as the partnership through the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research. Really just an amazing group of scientists that have been providing foundational science on the Great Lakes for roughly 40 to 50 years. So I want to pay tribute to those colleagues as well. And then finally, the sponsors for a lot of the research that you're going to be seeing for the past several years include NOAA, the Army Corps of Engineers, United States Geological Survey, the Great Lakes Protection Fund, as well as the Council for Great Lakes Governors and Premiers, and the Michigan Department of Transportation. So let's start off with a little bit of background on tackling the Great Lakes. And I think this satellite image of the Great Lakes sort of underscores the challenges we face when we try to understand all the different forces at play that are driving water levels over short-term timescales on the order of hours, days, and weeks, all the way out to months, years, and even decades. So this satellite image, you can see the outline here of Lake Superior. You can see the western shoreline of Lake Michigan here, Green Bay, the lower mid of Michigan down here to Lake Erie and off to Lake Ontario. Two sort of take-home messages from this slide, aside from just the magnitude and the scale of the processes. One is that the lakes are huge. They represent a prominent force on the landscape. But I also want to mention that we cannot learn about the lakes or about water levels purely by monitoring the land surface alone. Most hydrologic and climate science, at least when it comes to terrestrial processes, is focused on understanding rainfall and evapotranspiration, processes that take place on the land surface. One of the challenges we face with the Great Lakes is that we have to take measurements and run models out over the surfaces of lakes that really behave almost more like oceans than moderate-sized lakes. And you can see that in this image where we have processes out over the middle of the lakes that are noticeably different from what's happening over the land surface. So a brief point of context there in terms of the scope of the problem we're trying to address. This image brings things a little bit more close to home in terms of the Great Lakes and the basin. So the tan area is the boundary of the Great Lakes Basin. And what you can see here is that the Great Lakes themselves take up roughly 30 to 40% of the entire area of the basin, just an extraordinary extent of lake water surface. And just for reference here, when we look at the Great Lakes from a flow perspective, we know that water, collects in Lake Superior, flows down through the St. Mary's River into Lake Huron, interchanges with Lake Michigan through the Straits of Mackinac, and continues flowing down through the St. Clair River and Detroit River, through Lake Erie, over Niagara Falls, out through Lake Ontario, and out through the St. Lawrence River. A couple of the highlights here, you see there are some diversions of water into and out of the Great Lakes. Here we have diversions of water into the Great Lakes Basin at the Agokie and Long Lake diversion. And although it's not labeled clearly, there's also a large diversion of water out of the Great Lakes here at Chicago, which many of you know of. So this is just simply a reference map to get us oriented to the overall system. So let's go next and let's take a look at water levels on the Great Lakes. Later on, you're going to be hearing some wonderful talks about short-term and mid-range processes. Today, I want to emphasize water level changes on more of a monthly, seasonal, and even a multi-decadal scale. We're very lucky on the Great Lakes to have water level measurements that go all the way back to 1860. So on this slide, we're actually going to look at a composite of all the water level records on each of the lakes. On the bottom axis here, you can see water levels going back to 1860, all the way up to just a few months ago. On the vertical axis here, we can see water level surface elevation in meters. So what I want to point out here is that these scales are comparable to one another. So for example, when we look at the water level data here for Lake Superior, the scale of the numbers here is the same as the scale that we're looking at for Lake Michigan, Huron, and Erie. There's just a big gap here to represent the change in elevation as water goes through the St. Mary's River. And similarly, there's a gap here in the elevation, primarily due to the drop of water over Niagara Falls. But we're comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges when we look at the range of variability. So within each one of these data sets, we have three different types of points here. We have dark blue dots that represent the annual water level on each one of the lakes. We have light blue dots that represent the monthly average water level. And then we have a red line that represents the long-term average. One thing I want to point out is that with long-term water level records like this one, where we're averaging water levels over years and months, we view Lake Michigan and Huron as one large lake. And that's in part because the Straits of Mackinac are relatively deep and wide, such that the average water level over the entire surface of both lakes tend to be about the same when we average it over these long time periods. And that's why you see Lake Michigan and Huron combined into one data record in this particular plot. Now, we could spend an awful lot of time looking at all the ups and downs of water levels on this plot, but I want to highlight just a few time periods and geographic domains to emphasize when we look at this record. One of which is if you look at the outlet, if you look at Lake Ontario, starting in around 1960, many of you know that the outflow from Lake Ontario began to be regulated in the mid-1960s when the Moses-Saunders Dam was constructed. And one of the things you'll notice is if you look at variability from year to year across the entire system, you can actually, there's a visually identifiable reduction in the variability due to the construction of that dam on Lake Ontario. And this brings up a range of issues regarding what constitutes natural variability across Great Lakes shorelines and what constitutes anthropogenic control across the Great Lakes. Many people view that control of water levels on Lake Ontario as an ecological disaster because it diminished the areal extent of a lot of the natural wetlands on Lake Ontario. But it's an interesting point to look at nonetheless. Now, if we shift and look across all the upper lakes from, let's say, the late 1990s until about 2010, we enter what many people remember as a period of pronounced low water levels, particularly on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. In fact, in January of 2013, Lake Michigan and Lake Huron hit their all-time record low water levels. And this prompted a lot of people in the media and the public domains to ask questions about where that water was going. This particular image appeared in the news that shows Lake Michigan on the left. And instead of Lake Huron on the right, we just see a large drain, sort of evoking this image that we have really no idea where the water has been going, but it's going and is going fast. And a lot of the narrative around water levels during that time period was influenced by, from my perspective, a national narrative related justifiably to climate change, but also to a narrative that evolved around aridity and drought. So the idea that temperatures are going up, evaporation is going up, this is happening all around the country, and the Great Lakes are potentially falling into that paradigm. But if you just wait a few years, what happens here on the Great Lakes is that things can change. And so starting in 2014, this last time period that I'm highlighting here across all the lakes represented the fastest rate of water level increase ever in recorded history. So put differently, on Lake Superior and Lake Michigan and Huron, between 2014 and 2019, water levels had never risen as quickly over that same number of years. Just an extraordinary turnaround in water levels. This led to record highs on Lake Erie. Monthly records were set on Lake Michigan. And here's a point I want to make to everybody that I think is absolutely profound. Lake Ontario is regulated. It's designed to have a constraint on the highs and lows. But so much water came through the system in 2017 and 2019 that if you look at the bottom right here, you can see these two light blue dots. In 2017, and then again in 2019, all-time record highs were set on Lake Ontario, and they happened during this period of regulation. So from our perspective in hydrology, we attribute that to an extraordinary amount of water that came through the system and it simply couldn't be controlled. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But during this time period when water levels surged, there was a lot of attention again on what might happen when water levels are high and how we mitigate high water levels. This is an image that came from a cover article we wrote for the journal EOS, but it's sort of, I like this picture because it's sort of an iconic image of the Chicago skyline as well as the bike path here flooding in 2015. I found it also interesting that the Chicago Tribune ran a cover article in February of 2021 around this time period that water levels were extraordinarily high, indicating that the city of Joliet, just outside of Chicago, was running out of water. And this is an important narrative regarding the Great Lakes water level story, that even when there are periods of water level abundance on the Great Lakes, there are areas along the periphery of the Great Lakes, particularly those that draw from groundwater aquifers, that either have contaminated groundwater or the groundwater aquifers are literally running dry, as they did it in Joliet. So it's an amazing sort of contrast and juxtaposition we have here in the Great Lakes, where the Great Lakes Compact prohibits the transport of water across the Great Lakes Basin. There are periods when we have water abundance in the Great Lakes, yet there are communities outside of the Great Lakes that are literally running out of water. And this is something that we're paying a lot of attention to in our research. So what I want to do next is shift gears and talk a little bit about both conventional as well as new understandings we have about the water balance of the Great Lakes. Essentially, what that means is the amount of water coming in, the amount of water leaving, and any change in that being reflected in water levels, and what we think might be happening in the future. So just to make sure we start off on the same page, this graph that I'm showing on the screen on the left-hand side shows a basic summary of the key components of the Great Lakes water balance. So what I have here is for each of the lakes, we're summarizing the total amount of water that comes into each lake and leaves each lake through these three main, what I call water balance components. And the first, represented by the green bar on each lake, is runoff. That represents all the water that comes into each lake through rivers and streams, but not through what we call the major connecting channel. So I'll refer to that in a minute. But for example, the St. Mary's River is not included in these totals. Lake Superior does not have a major inflowing river coming into it from an upstream lake. So we have here in green all the water coming in through rivers and streams. This blue bar represents the magnitude of water that comes into Lake Superior directly from precipitation on the surface of the lake. And I want to pause here for a moment and just underscore how extraordinary it is that Lake Superior and Lake Michigan and Lake Huron receive more water through rainfall and snowfall on the surface of the lakes than they do for the water that hits land and comes in through rivers and streams. It's really hard to find any freshwater system on Earth that has that same characteristic. Finally, the pink bars that you see in each one of these panels represent the amount of water lost through evaporation off the surface of the lakes. The numbers that you see at the top or the bottom of each one of these bars represent a long-term average flow rate. We convert these numbers into flow, as you'll see in a minute, for comparison to the channel flows, but these are in thousands of cubic meters per second. So this represents just the amount of water coming into and leaving each lake basin through these major components. Now, if I shift gears and look on the right-hand side of the screen, we can look at the magnitude of water that transfers in between each one of the lakes. So for example, this green bar right here that I'm highlighting with the 2.2 above it, that is the flow out of Lake Superior through the St. Mary's River into Lake Huron. And on long-term average, it has a flow of around 2,200 cubic meters per second. As we go down through the system, through the St. Clair and Detroit River, and then out through the St. Lawrence Seaway, we can see that flow increasing. By the time water leaves Lake Ontario, on average, it has a flow around 7,000 cubic meters per second. And I just want to pause and highlight that for a moment. 7,000 cubic meters per second is an awful lot of water. It's really a continental scale flow. If you look at flow in other rivers around the continent, it turns out that the flow through the St. Lawrence Seaway, by the time it reaches the Gulf of St. Lawrence, is the second highest continental discharge off of North America. Mississippi River is number one, St. Lawrence is number two. And all these other rivers, the Yukon, the Columbia, they fall well below the discharge from the St. Lawrence Seaway. So these are major flows that we're talking about here. And then finally, these flows right here, I mentioned earlier the diversions into and out of the Great Lakes Basin. This pink bar represents the amount of flow coming into the Great Lakes through the Ogoki and Long Lake diversion. And then this bar represents the magnitude and the approximate amount of flow that leaves the Great Lakes through the Chicago diversion into the sanitary and shipping canal. So we take a look back. What you see on the screen here is really a summary of the major inflows and outflows through the Great Lakes system And seasonal and long-term changes in these amounts are what ultimately change water levels on the Great Lakes. Now, there's been a lot of research done to understand different hydrological processes. One of the areas of research that I'm most excited about over the past decade has been understanding evaporation. So if you remember, I mentioned earlier about to understand Great Lakes water levels, you have to get out over the lakes. Some of you who have been with me on a talk like this before have heard me say this, but this is a lighthouse. Many of you might recognize the White Shoal Lighthouse on the northern end of Lake Michigan. It still is active as a passive Coast Guard station, but it turns out it's an ideal location for an evaporation tower. And so when I was at NOAA, we partnered with several colleagues, including Peter Blanken of the University of Colorado Boulder, who ultimately worked to install 6 evaporation towers on lighthouses like this one across the Great Lakes. We look at this image and we think it would be a great opportunity for a student winter internship program, although that would probably violate some OSHA regulations. But nonetheless, this is an example of how the Great Lakes community has been learning more about the water balance components and what drives water level change. I also want to show you a result from a paper that we published recently. My colleague, Eric Anderson, was the lead author. What you're seeing here is an image collected from what we call a thermistor chain that has been deployed at the bottom of Lake Michigan for decades. A thermistor chain is a long string of connected, basically thermometers that are measuring long-term temperature in the Great Lakes. It's moored or it's anchored on the bottom, and then it leads upwards and it's held just below the surface. So it measures depth, it measures temperature at various depths throughout Lake Michigan. And what we did is we looked at the results of decades of temperature measurements from this thermistor chain, and we integrated them into long-term trends in each month of the year and at various depths. So in this particular image, what you're seeing is in each one of these square or rectangular cells, you're seeing a color that reflects the long-term trend, either in terms of warming or cooling in a particular month and at a particular depth. And what we found that was somewhat astonishing was when we looked at this long-term record, we found that in the months of January, February, March, and April, down below the surface, which is where we typically get our understanding of the Great Lakes, we're seeing this extraordinary pocket of warming happening in the winter, which led us to sort of put together the phrase that winter is vanishing from one of Earth's largest lakes. What we also see that's interesting, though, is other areas where there's a cooling. So there's a shift in the balance of the heat content of the lakes, and this has major implications for long-term ice cover as well as evaporation. And this ultimately made its way into the journal Nature Communications with this title right here. I also want to share with you some research that we've been doing to take a look at just exactly what's been happening in terms of the water balance that's led to these major swings in water levels over the past several decades. So this slide has an awful lot of information on it, but what you're seeing here are different components of the water balance over time, starting back in 1950. So each panel is a time series, starting in 1950 and going through relatively roughly to the present. Each one of the panels has a water balance component shown. So in the upper left-hand corner here, we're looking at precipitation on the land. And then this next panel in the top middle is evapotranspiration from the land. And then the upper right is essentially the difference between the two, which is more or less what we get in terms of runoff. The bars have different colors to represent either positive or negative anomalies. In other words, how far above or below the average were each one of these water balance components over time. And the black line represents a long-term sort of trend or a smoothed average line. So for example, if we look at precipitation on the land surface of the Great Lakes, we can see not only that precipitation has been going up relatively steadily, but the gray area that I highlight, sort of the past decade or so, was pretty extraordinary when it comes to back-to-back years of precipitation. But what's interesting is that on the land surface, we also see a consistent increase in evapotranspiration, the amount of water that's lost primarily through plants. And this is consistent with what we get when we read the literature on climate change, that increasing temperatures are going to allow the atmosphere to carry more moisture and bring more precipitation to the Great Lakes, but they're also going to lead to increased evapotranspiration on the land surface. What we found fascinating is when you look at the lakes themselves, not just the land surface, but the surfaces of each lakes, We can start here on the bottom left, and this is an image of what we are seeing over the surface of the lakes through an extraordinary surge in precipitation on the surface of the lakes over the past decade. And then here's another part that we found fascinating. When we looked at the evaporation record over the surface of the lakes, many people assumed that evaporation on the surface of the lakes would continue to be going up. In 2014, many of you remember there was an Arctic polar vortex deformation. Some people refer to it as the polar vortex in the media. The lakes got very cold and evaporation slowed down. So to finish off this slide, what I want to show you is if you have the Great Lakes and we have a water balance based on precipitation coming in and evaporation leaving, and for a period of about 10 years, precipitation goes up and through the roof and water loss through evaporation slows down, we have on the bottom right here the net amount of water coming onto each of the lakes. And it was that net amount of water that really drove that ultimate surge in water levels that we saw over the past decade that led to those record highs. This phenomenon in which we have precipitation increasing and gaining strength over time through climate change, but also evaporation tending to go up, but with a lot more variability. We're referring to this almost as a tug of war on the long-term water balance of the Great Lakes. And we summarize those ideas in a recent paper in Geophysical Research Letters. So I want to finish up with just a couple comments here about long-term water level projections. So if you want to run a model that simulates water levels of the Great Lakes, looking out years or even decades, you not only have to simulate precipitation, evaporation, and runoff, but you also have to simulate continental movement of air masses that influence what precipitation and evaporation are going to be in the Great Lakes. And this image sort of summarizes what those major air masses are. So for example, in the bottom right, one of the common air masses that influences North America is this maritime tropical air mass, warm, moist air that sometimes comes out of the Gulf of Mexico. When that air mass dominates our system, we have an increase in precipitation and things get warmer. But we can periodically have continental polar air from the upper middle part come into the Great Lakes, and that's very dry and cold. What I want to point out is that forecasting the long-term behavior of these air masses is incredibly challenging, yet it's something we need to do if we're going to understand how water levels are going to change over the coming years and decades. And finally, I'll leave you with this slide right here, which has to do what I think is a sort of a trade-off between long-term water level projections and management decisions. This is a quote from a water manager from the New York City water distribution system, who basically was quoted as saying, 2100 doesn't keep me up at night, indicating that even though there may be a long-term trend in water supply or water levels over multi-decadal periods, their management decisions that need to be made on much shorter timescales, and the variability we expect to see in Great Lakes water levels over the coming months and years is likely to match and even surpass the variability that we've seen in the past over those shorter term timescales. So I will leave it at that. And I believe we have a few minutes for some questions before we transition to the next speaker. So thank you all for your attention. And Wendy, I'm happy to answer questions as time allows.
Great. Thank you, Drew. We have one question. Nathan Skibby from Alpena Charter Township asked, Lake Nipigon, I believe that's how it's pronounced, isn't classified as an input for Lake Superior. Can you answer that, Drew? Is that
I can answer the question. So can you see my screen again?
Yep.
Here?
Yep.
So great question. So just so everyone's clear, if you look back at this plot right here, so Lake Nipigon is this lake right up here, north of Lake Superior. It is a massive lake. You can see it's 3 times the size of Lake St. Clair. It's bigger than most other lakes in the United States. Most people don't know about it, but it is in the Lake Superior Basin. So great question. So flow through Lake Nipigon is accounted for in our models and our data sets. So when we look at the total runoff coming into Lake Superior, we do account for the amount of water that flows through the EGLE diversion, through Lake Nipigon, and down through the Lake Nipigon River. Those are accounted for. One interesting nuance to that, though, is in order to get those records accurate, we actually have to have a binational relationship. We have to be able to call up representatives of the Canadian federal government and find out how much water they've been diverting in through this diversion right here in order to get our total runoff amounts out. But in short, Lake Nipigon is accounted for in our water balance, but the flows through are a little bit tricky because they're controlled by a gate valve right up here on the boundary of the basin. So great question.
Right. Other questions? Don't see any in the inbox so far. I would say that we get questions as a part of the Coastal Leadership Academy about predictions for community decision makers and trying to communicate with their, their residents, their constituents. Is there anything like that on the horizon where there would be projections maybe for the next couple of years about lake levels?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll frame my response to that, Wendy, just a little bit. There's actually a range of different forecasts that are made all the time for the Great Lakes. Guy Meadows and his colleagues at Michigan Tech and other folks at NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory are experts on short-term forecasting. They developed amazing models of forecasts on the order of hours and days up until about weeks. And some of the forecasts, when we get out for a couple of weeks, sort of reach the end of what meteorological forecasts can provide as sort of a bounding condition. Then there are also water level forecasts at seasonal scales that look out to about 1 to 6 months or so. And those start to be based on sort of recent or long-term 6-month trends in water levels. There is a major gap, Wendy, and whoever, other folks who are asking this question, there's a major gap in research on what water level projections are on this sort of 6-month to 2-month time range. And one of the reasons for that is when we look at that slide that I showed earlier about these big air masses, if I can jump down to it quickly enough here, is that we can develop models to do a pretty good idea of what the trends in these air masses might be over, let's say, 50 years, that periodically they might change in this way or that, but computer models are not at the ability yet where they can say something to the effect of 13 months from now, there's going to be an Arctic polar vortex deformation. The models are not capable of that right now. So that 1 to 2 year time frame represents a major gap in knowledge. And I'll finish off by saying a bunch of funding just came through the major infrastructure bill that was passed to help NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers fill that gap. And I'm involved in a project on that right now that's being led by NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. So it is a big gap, but we're working to fill it.
Great. I'm sure many community members are interested in following that. That's great. We do have a question here from Linda Farrell. Are aquifers running dry because precipitation has decreased over land?
It's very complicated. So these aquifers, there can be several layers of aquifers beneath a city or beneath a municipality. And the extent to which a particular aquifer might rapidly dry up or be depleted is a complex combination of where it gets recharged from. So some aquifers can be replenished relatively quickly if they're somehow connected to surface flows. But in large part, most aquifers have a very slow recharge rate, meaning that when aquifers go dry, it's often, if they go dry quickly, it's often because of overuse, because the recharge rate is relatively slow. So in the case of the aquifers below Juliet, I believe that they're quite deep, and that recharging those aquifers through surges in precipitation is not the way that they recharge. They recharge slowly, and that the diminishing or the depletion of the aquifer is primarily due to anthropogenic use and not because rainfall was low for any particular time period.
Right. Any other questions out there while we have Drew for another few minutes? Or anything, Drew, that you'd like to share with this group as they're trying to address their community concerns?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm happy to take questions, so please interrupt me if one does come in. But, we are working very hard and thinking hard about, especially with colleagues like Dick and Guy and others, on what sort of narrative we can use to translate what we're seeing in water level projections into management. And I recognize it's a challenge. And really the closest thing that we're coming to is recognizing that, depending on the time scale of a planning horizon, it's very feasible that over the next 5, 10, or 15 years, the Great Lakes could hit a record high again and a record low again. And we've seen this in the past 15 or 20 years where water levels have swung between these extremes. So when communities ask what should be planned for, I think one of the most pragmatic answers, unfortunately, is to plan on extremes, unless the timeline of a project or the timeline of a decision is so short, 2 to 3 years or something, where you could tolerate living within just one particular range. So I just want to underscore that's something that I and other scientists and colleagues are thinking about and want to continue discussing when it comes to short and long-term coastal management planning.
Well, I have a question, if we don't mind, if I could, because it speaks directly to that. So my question is, in this long-term planning horizon, what I just heard you say was really it's best to look backward and to really plan for those highs and lows. My question is, as things are changing, do you get the sense that that whole range has expanded, that looking backwards to highs and lows and planning for that entire space in between it may not be enough, that there may actually be higher highs and lower lows?
That's exactly correct. So in any environmental system, even if we kept the system, let's say, the same, and we just sort of kept running things over and over again, you will naturally set record highs and lows again. But what we're seeing is, because of this idea of this tug of war, where precipitation in the Great Lakes is going to keep going up. Yet there are going to be periods where evaporation is incredibly strong and pulls water levels down. When we look at these long-term simulations, we believe that new record highs are likely to be set and new record lows are likely to be set over relatively short time periods.
I was afraid of that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for spending time with us, Drew, today. We know you need to get off and scoot to your next thing. So with that, I think we will bring up Guy Meadows, who's going to talk about erosion. Thanks, Drew.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's the slide and the voice coming through?
Great.
All right.
Well said.
I'd like to thank Drew for a wonderful introduction. It's a tough act to follow Drew. He is top of his game there. I appreciate the way he set the stage for us all. I'd like to talk about three things today. Michigan's coastline viewer. I know most of you are familiar with that, but there's been some recent updates that I think are important for you to know. I want to talk about beach sediments moving offshore and the mechanisms responsible for that, and then wrap up with wind waves and water levels, which ties nicely into the background that Drew has provided for us, which was truly excellent. So on our coastlines through time, this is the website. It's available to everyone. It looks at how our shorelines of Michigan have evolved essentially from 1938 to the present. 2020 is the last comprehensive photograph available. There are 6 time steps between 1938 and 2020 that we provide, and we have resolution of over 1,200 miles of Michigan's exposed shorelines down to the individual property owner level. So it shows how your property, your neighborhood, your community, your region has responded to these tremendous changes that we've seen in water levels, wave energy, and the other drivers of coastal change. We're, not perfect. There's some major exceptions to that coverage. Some of the 1938 original photographs have been lost over time. In the 2020, most recent ones are not over all of Michigan's shorelines. Tawas Point, and I know there's quite a contingent today from Tawas area. It's an area that I spent a lot of my summers in. There's some gaps that we're working very hard to fill, and this work has been supported by EGLE, by the Coastal Zone Management Program. This is one of our poster child areas south of St. Joe, Benton Harbor on Lake Michigan. This shows the long-term shoreline change. It's showing out here in the In the purple area, that it's greater than a meter per year, so a little over 3 feet per year. The blue line out here is the 1938 shoreline. The orange line is the bluff line in 1938. This background is the 2020 image, so that's one of the updates. Here, the blue line is the shoreline in 2020 and the bluff line, and then the red hashed mark is if this erosion rate continues from 1938 to the present at the same rate, this is where the bluff line will be 30 years from the present. So that's kind of a scary prediction for a lot of Lake Michigan. We also have recalculated what we call the nearshore or the short-term erosion rate. Also, by checking a different box up here in the menu theme, you can bring this up. Typically, this is much greater than the long-term because this is 2009 through 2020, which is the rapid rise we just heard about in lake levels and the rapid change that has occurred along the coastline. The fact that it is very small in this example is because this coastline is almost 100% revetted. So the intersection of land and water is not moving in this short-term view as you would expect it to be, but that does not mean that erosion is not occurring. Erosion is occurring downward. The lake bed is deepening as a result of the revetment pinning the intersection of land and water. So just because we don't see it in a changed beach, it doesn't mean that erosion is not going on. And I'll come back to that point in a few minutes. So if we look at natural beach change and where this sediment is going, I want to talk about the natural beach and how it behaves, the effect of revetments, and the effect of groins and harbor structures. So a natural beach, the upper diagram is beach under low water levels. The wave energy at low water levels is less incident at the shoreline than it is during high water levels. The waves are more mellow. And the end result is a natural beach has the ability to store sand in this berm above water level. And the beach has the ability, again, if it's natural, to be able to reconfigure itself in the most efficient way, the most dissipative way to wave energy as water level and wave energy changes. And it's constantly in motion in doing that. When we have high water level, the lower diagram, that beach then in trying to flatten out its slope and create offshore bars takes sediment away from this storage in the upland region, the berm, and transport that offshore into the form of our very common 3 sandbar configuration that we see along most of our sandy shores of the Great Lakes. And the purpose of those sandbars is to trip those larger waves that are occurring in high water times, to trip them offshore and breaking. They reform, break on the second bar, they reform, break on the most inward bar. So that is nature's way of dissipating that wave energy in a very efficient process. So if the beach is able to do that, that is what will happen over these periods of high water level. If you have a natural shoreline that is configured of rock, like we have a lot of in Lake Superior, or if it's artificially configured in rock, as with the revetment, that serves to remove sand from the nearshore region and store it in offshore bars. Essentially, the waves reflect off the hard barrier of the rock steep slope and compared to a natural beach, and pushes that sand further offshore. We began after the high water in 1986 to conduct comprehensive surveys along Lake Michigan and Lake Huron shorelines. We continued that for some 20 years and then began starting that up again in 2020. So from 1988 to 2008, we had almost annual surveys at these locations all up and down the shoreline. This is an example of the area just south of New Buffalo, which has been pretty devastatingly hurt by erosion. And what I'd like to point out is, where is the sand going? So these are each survey that happened, the original ones in In 1988 are the red lines, and you see an offshore bar, a middle bar, and nearshore bars. But what's really striking is here in 2020, during the high peak in water levels, is all those nearshore bars are totally obliterated. So this is the lime green line that I'm pointing to. And there's no inner bar, there's no middle bar. There is just one large offshore bar, and it's further offshore than we've ever seen before in the 34 years that we've been looking at this particular site. So the big events that were associated with high water and revetments have driven that sand further offshore, and we see a deepening in the offshore region that we had not seen before as well. Same thing happens with harbor structures or groins that were a common thing to do during the earlier high water levels in the Great Lakes. So whether it's a large harbor like St. Joe Benton Harbor on the left side or New Buffalo on the right side, a recreational harbor, the same thing happens. Sediment is driven offshore by the jetties. You can see the sediment plumes out in this area, and you can see the same thing at New Buffalo here, driving sediment further offshore. Again, we're looking very conscientiously under NOAA funding to try and find out where that sand is being deposited and whether it gets pushed offshore by these harbor structures or pushed offshore by hardened shoreline armoring. The question is, how far offshore can it be pushed and still return to the beach during low water levels? And we're seeing that there's a tremendous amount of sediment being pushed off into deeper water, and it's a loss of natural material from the nearshore region. Quick look at wind, waves, and water levels. As Drew perfectly outlined, we see major shifts in storm patterns on decadal types of scales. These are responsible for the precipitation and evaporation balance, as Drew pointed out, and ultimately resulting in high water level periods and low water level periods. But during those high water level periods, we are seeing more frequent and more intense storms. That's what brings the precipitation to the basins, but we're also seeing increases in wind and wave energy because the storms, again, are more frequent and more intense. And eventually that results into high water levels in the Great Lakes as the runoff component adds to what precipitation falls directly over the lake basins themselves. But it also causes increases in the wind strength, which is immediate with the arrival of the storms. And of course, the wind makes waves. So the wave energy is immediate with the storms. Wave heights and wave energy are on the order of 20 to 25% higher during high water years than they are during low water years. So when water level rises in the Great Lakes, we also have leading that a rise in wind strength and wave energy at the shoreline. So the shoreline takes a tremendous hit. This is a paper we published back in 1997. Over here on the left-hand side is 1958, and over on the right-hand side, 1992. So 32 years of water level data and wave energy calculated by the Army Corps of Engineers. So this is the wave energy and how it changed from 1958 towards high water level in 1986. This is a smooth line of the water level. And what we see is not only does wave energy rise as water levels rise, but the wave energy begins to come up about 18 months before water level responds. And most of that time is associated with the runoff working its way through the complicated mechanisms to get that back into the lake, get that water into the lake. But again, Corps of Engineers assessment of shoreline damages, two big peaks in shoreline damage, and they correspond with the peak in wave energy, not necessarily the peak in water level. So our takeaway from that is water level is the enabler. It changes the place along the beach or along property where waves can do their work, but it is the increase in wave energy that is really responsible for moving sediment out. Well, that was pretty exciting back in 1997, but does that happen again? So this is a new 42-year wave hindcalf that we did ourselves rather than relying on data from the Corps of Engineers. That spans 1988 through 2020. So it includes the most recent high water level that peaked in 2019 in Lake Superior and then peaked in 2020 in Lakes Michigan and Huron. So again, the blue lines and the various graphs are all along the Michigan shoreline of Lake Michigan. These are locations where we also have coastal monitoring buoys. So the blue line is the rise in wave height, and the pink line, magenta line, is the rise in water level. So again, through 2010 on, this big shift that we saw in storm tracks and climate, we see in all these cases that wave energy along the Michigan shoreline, whether you're in the south part of the basin or the north part, begins to rise before the water levels begin to rise. So this has happened again in 2020. So we think we might be onto something there, that the wind and waves are a precursor to rising water level. Well, is that good news or bad news? And most recently, I'll draw you back to 2 weeks ago, a major storm in the Great Lakes. Wave heights reached 22 feet in Lake Superior and about 19 feet in Lake Michigan. So this is a major wind event that we saw in very, very recent history. 22-foot waves in Lake Superior are about a 50-year wave. That means we expect to see storms of that magnitude about once in 50 years. So is that signaling a new trend? So good news, Lake Michigan water levels, this is the most recent 6-month projection by the Army Corps of Engineers for October of this year. The next one will be out later this week for November. Recall Lake Michigan and Huron peaked in 2020. Been a nice decay in water levels here through 2021. And again, here through 2020, we still are seeing decreases. And then the Corps of Engineers projections here are showing a decrease on through the rest of the year for the next 6 months. Well, Lake Superior is not showing that. And again, recall when Michigan and Huron peaked in 20, Superior peaked in the year before, in 2019. 53% of the water of all the Great Lakes is in Lake Superior. Another way to say that is Lake Superior holds more water than the other 4 Great Lakes combined. So when Lake Superior starts to go up, it may be an indication, as Drew pointed out, that we're going to send you a lot of nice clean water from Lake Superior down to Lake Michigan and Huron. So I'm not going to go so far as to make a prediction, but as again was pointed out in Drew's talk, we expect to see more variability. There's no guarantee that we'll have 8 to 14 years of low water like we did leading up to the 2020 high water. It may not happen. So we are seeing greater variability in water levels. So I'll leave it at that and suggest that we might want to be watching for what happens in the very near future. Thank you very much. Pleasure being here, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you all.
Thank you. That was terrific. Appreciate that. So we're going to hold our questions until all 3 of our stars from the videos have had a chance to present. So we are going to move from Guy to Ethan, if you are ready to go with your slide.
All right, let's see here. Get this queued up. Let me actually swap this desktop too, and then we'll go in presentation mode.
Looks good.
Okay, can you see me okay?
Yes.
All right, I'll get this out of the way. Years of Zoom teaching now. Okay, so thank you so much for having me. Drew and Guy gave a great sort of segue into what I'm going to talk about, which is some of the work that we've been doing in association with the coastal program, really all about trying to understand where that sand is going once we have erosion and what we can sort of learn in terms of resilience planning from understanding where that sand is moving. And the focus of the talk and the focus of our work really comes down to answering a question that probably a lot of you, if you're managing beaches, want to know, which is, will our beaches come back after a high phase of lake level? And if they do, how quickly? And are we going to get it back, the same way that it looked prior to lake level rising? And certainly, you probably have some indication that now, because of armoring or changes in the water level fluctuation rate, that, this may be more challenging than just assuming we're always getting our beach back the way we had it. And so, the focus of our work has been really trying to understand where that sediment goes. That's kind of the first step in all of this, is being able to track that, understand why it did what it did, and then use that to make some predictions. So my work is largely related to understanding, being the change on the coastline and using that to predict what might happen in the future. And there's really sort of two ways that sand move in the coastal zone. The first way is something you're probably familiar with through the Leadership Academy, which is longshore transport or littoral transport. And that's sand moving along the shoreline. That's what we hear about when we talk about sand getting trapped up in a harbor structure and maybe depleting sand from other areas, sort of downdrift of that. But sand can also move in the cross-shore direction. It can move back onto the beach, or it can move away from the beach. And Guy's example just a minute ago, where he talked about all that sand moving further offshore, is a great example of cross-shore sediment transport. So that's what we're really trying to document, is which pathway for any given site will that sand take? And knowing that gives us a way of indicating future resilience. Will the sand sort of stay out just offshore, which then it can kind of move back once lake level drops? Or is it sort of moved quickly away from the site, or maybe really far offshore? As to what might happen in the future. And all of that stuff changes based on what the site looks like. And so we're looking at a bunch of different sites. Geography matters. So thinking about, what way the site is oriented in terms of those winds and waves that Guy just talked about, how much sand is actually at the site, and then, what kind of armoring, what kind of structures do we have? Do we have a harbor structure? Do we have, a large revetment? Which way are the prevailing winds? All of that stuff is going to change how that material actually moves. And we need to understand that, and then also understand how that relates to how the sediment is actually moving, if we're going to get to being able to tell you all the kind of information you probably want to know about how your site might behave moving forward. So for our project, we're looking at a range of sites throughout Lake Michigan and Lake Huron that sort of typify the types of coastal sites we have in this region. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to go out and map the coast and understand sort of what the coast looks like. So here on the left, you're seeing an example of just a mapped area of the near shore and the beach. But then if we do that over enough time, we can actually look at erosion and accretion patterns. And that gives us an indication of how the coast is changing. So you can see the map here on the right shows you the red areas where sand's eroding, and the blue areas are where sand is accreting. And we're going to talk here in a second about what those patterns might tell us about resilience. So in order to make those maps, we have to go out in the field and generate those data. So we actually use drones to do most of our mapping of the beach and dunes. And so we fly these drones and we basically generate a sequence of images. So we can take these images and then back in the computer lab, end up actually stitching them all together. And when you stitch them together, you end up with data, millions of data points that we can then use to generate maps of the coast. So this picture you're looking at looks like a picture, but it's actually 29 million data points of what the elevation of the beach looks like on that day. So we can generate all kinds of products from this. So we can get nice pictures that we can then sort of link in with the stuff that Guy talked about with the historical aerial photography. But then we can also get actual models and maps of the beach, sort of shape and geometry from time to time. And so the beach portion is important. That certainly tells us sort of where the sand or how much sand is getting eroded away. It's a part that most of us really care about. But we want to know where that sand went. So we actually have to go out in the lake and start picking it up and tracking it. So we use a couple of different techniques for that. So we'll use a boat, or we'll also use remotely operated vehicles. So things with sonar attached to them where we stand on the shoreline and are actually able to map it. And you see, we still have a gap. So in the area where there's a lot of change happening, both of these techniques actually can't map it. So we have to physically get in there and map the area. So this is very sort of field intensive work. But what we end up with is a full three-dimensional picture of what the beach and nearshore actually looks like. So now we can really start to evaluate where that sand is going. And it allows us to say, hey, the sand left here and it went here. And that tells us something about where, where that sand's going, why it did that, and then what the actual processes are sort of moving forward and what that might mean for sort of managing that area. And again, the red are areas of erosion and blue are areas of deposition. So now I want to show you sort of some of the data products that we've generated from this and what they actually mean. And I'm going to start with like the best case scenario. I think the scenario that all of us hope happens once lake level starts to come back up. And so this is the ideal scenario. It's an area that's up in the thumb of Michigan, Port Crescent State Park. It has very minimal armoring. It's in the middle of sort of a coastal embayment. But we still saw lots of erosion as lake level came up. So we lost about 20 meters of our dune. We had lots of erosion of the actual foredune area. So you can see all of this red area here, but all of this material just went and it sat offshore in these sandbars. And so when you actually do the math, you can see the gain of sand in the near shore is about 18,000 cubic meters. The loss was about 13,000. That's pretty balanced. And so this is a place where, and you can actually see it when you sort of slice it another way, you can see that that material that was actually eroding really just kind of went offshore and created new bars and kind of filled in holes in the lake. And so this is your like ideal scenario. Yeah, you've lost the beach and the dune temporarily, but that sand is sitting offshore. And as lake level falls, this is a place where we would think there's a lot of potential for that material to make its way back on the beach and grow the dune and grow those beaches again. There's minimal armoring to sort of, impact that. So this is a very natural system, very, high resilience capacity. Let's look at another example from South Haven. So we've mapped this area over time. And the first thing that we see with this is that this is an area, so if we're looking at 2012 to 2021, so this is during the rising lake level period, we see sort of a typical pattern for a harbor structure. This blue area indicates that we have sand sort of accreting on the updrift side of the harbor. And we think that a lot of that sand's coming from the erosion north of that area, a very similar pattern that we see all up and down the coast. However, you can see that this actually starts to wrap around the harbor structure. And some of it's actually sort of making its way back towards the beach on the south side. So this is a place where you're trapping some sand, but you are able to move some of it. So maybe not as bad as you would expect for some harbor structures. It's not trapping everything. Some of it can move away. But then we actually went out over the last year and mapped this again, and you're starting to see a lot of erosion in the near shore during a period when we actually saw lake level dropping. So this is kind of interesting and gives us an insight into the dynamics of these fluctuating lake levels and what they do with sand, because essentially the faucet has been turned off for that sediment updrift of South Haven. So basically, we don't have as much erosion of the beach and dunes, so the nearshore isn't getting as much sand. So what we're doing is we're actually sort of reworking the material that's in that area right now, and it's sort of making its way through the system. So this gives us a really nice indication of what we sort of might expect as lake level starts to drop. We hope that that material starts to maybe make its way back on to the beaches. Now, another example where we think where there's pretty low potential for recovery is an area offshore of Saugatuck. So Saugatuck has had a lot of lake bed erosion, and this is partly because that area is a bluff area, so there's less sand in the system to begin with in a lot of these places, but there's also been extensive armoring along this shoreline. And so you can see the very dark areas of red are areas where the lake bed has been scoured out. And so those places, you're going to have to really bring in a lot of sediment from the littoral drift to start filling that area back in before you actually get the beaches to redevelop. However, there are pockets where the erosion is less, and even some places where we actually see accretion. So one of the things that we're sort of looking at is going in and taking some of those data that Guy has on the bluff retreat, and then some of the data that NOAA have about shoreline armoring, and trying to really understand sort of local scale connections between where the sand's going and what that sort of shoreline actually looks like. But by and large, in these places where we have lots of armoring and we have minimal sand and bluff erosion, we think this is an area where there's low potential for recovery. And so with that, I would just like to thank the sort of large hosts of students that work in my lab group, technicians that are out actually collecting the data. A lot of this work I'm doing in collaboration with Guy, lots of other projects I'm doing in collaboration with Dr. Norton, and then of course, EGLE and NOAA for funding this work. This is really an exciting sort of next step in trying to put some of these forecasting pieces together and understanding sort of the resilience of these coastal areas. So looking forward to seeing your questions here in a few minutes.
That was great. Thank you, Ethan. We did have a couple of questions come in, so we are looking forward to that. And then we're going to get Dick Norton loaded up and ready to go. All right, take it away.
All right, can you see that?
Yes.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to now take the transition. So all of the great science that you've been learning about and hearing, I'm going to try and put into context with some community planning and legal implications. And I'll just point out, this is a picture I just got recently from Guy Meadows, who took it while he was out doing his field work this fall. And it's an image of a structure. I have no idea what it's doing out there or how it got there, or if it's permitted. It's located north of South Haven, I believe, or St. Joe. Guy can tell us later where it came from, but oh my gosh, if you don't plan for things, you might end up with some strange things happening. Okay, so just quickly, everything that we've been talking about are the shocks and the stresses to the system that we have to deal with on Lake Michigan that you all need to be planning for. And in the Great Lakes context, that's mainly water level fluctuations and increased storminess. And they're not unrelated, as Guy and Ethan and Drew just pointed out, but they're creating a real stress on the system. In a legal context, two things to be aware of. One is that we are subject to a public trust doctrine. All of the Great Lakes states are. And under that doctrine, when the shorelines move back and forth, the ownership of the land changes naturally. So lands that accrete when the lake levels go down and you get that great sand pushed up onto the beach, the shoreline property owner gains ownership of that land to the water's edge. Now, folks still have the right to walk along that beach because of the public trust doctrine, but it's owned by the adjacent shoreline property owner. The flip side of that is true as well. As the shoreline erodes away slowly, the ownership of the land naturally converts from private shoreline property ownership to ownership by the state. The state owns the submerged bottomlands of the Great Lakes. That has some legal implications that we'll talk about later on. The real challenge in the Great Lakes setting is, I think it's actually harder to manage what's going on here than it is on the ocean coast. So the ocean coast are experiencing sea level rise, which it's going to be constant. It's variable across the different settings, but it's going to be constant over time. And folks know it's happening, and you can see that moving in over time. The problem on the Great Lakes is we have this kind of one-step lakeward, two-step landward progression. So when the lakes are high, really active erosion going on, the shorelines get chewed away. But when they go back down, we get some of that beach back. So it gives us a sense that maybe the beach is just moving back and forth over time, and it allows us to not pay attention to the fact that in most of the Great Lakes settings, the shoreline is slowly receding landward over time. There's a background erosion rate, and that's much like sea level rise. We're basically losing shoreland over time to the lakes. That's a natural process, and the forces involved are just tremendous. Oh my gosh. So there are more here than I'm going to be able to talk about in detail, but we've been publishing a number of papers from all the work we've been doing for the last couple of decades, especially with the help of the Coastal Management Program. And one of the papers I had published recently came out in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia, and it's a pretty thorough step through of planning for coastal shoreline resilience. And I provide the HTML there to get to it, and I won't step through all of these things, but some of the key principles that we need to take account of are to recognize that our economic systems are nested within social systems, which in turn are nested within ecological systems, which is to say, if you're going to protect the economic system, you have to protect the social system first. And if you're going to do that, you have to protect the ecological system. If you're a beach community that is ultimately dependent on the natural features that the Great Lakes shoreline provides, then you need to worry about protecting those natural features if you want to maintain the social and economic system you have. Is a way of thinking about that. We need to approach planning holistically and systematically. We need to promote infrastructure efficient, society enhancing, ecologically protective landscape policies, worry about the landscape, think about identifying no regrets policies first, no regrets. In other words, even if it doesn't turn out to be as bad as we feared, the policies that we adopted are still making us better off. Kind of move from those first, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, to the more difficult policies to address. Encourage learning. These is not going to change, and residents will be new to the community. We need to continually keep educating ourselves about what's going on here. I'm a big believer we need government. It doesn't need to be big, but it needs to be good. And in order to have good government, we need to support it, and we need to make good decisions, and then we need to hold the government feet to the fire to make sure they're making good decisions. So we need to rethink how we're portraying government, I think, today in our larger political dialogue. Okay, given those principles, there are a number of analytical methods that coastal communities should really be thinking about doing through their planning efforts to make sure they're making plans and policies that are as robust and sound as possible. So you want to analyze the suitability. Where are the good places to build, and the places that you don't want to build? Where is there existing infrastructure that we want to try and maximize and make as efficient as possible? Where are the really ecological sensitive places that we want to protect? Where are the really high hazardous places that we want to maybe try and avoid new substantial development in? Where are our socially vulnerable populations? Cumulatively, don't just think about impacts that might happen today or tomorrow, but look at all of the impacts could be happening over time, and don't piecemeal them, because you're going to lose out on understanding the larger systematic impacts that you're going to affect. Consistency analysis, look at what you're doing through your downtown development authority planning efforts and what you're doing through your hazard mitigation planning efforts, and recognize you may be actually planning for growth and development in the most high hazard places, unless you're thinking carefully about the consistency in your approach across planning documents. And then finally, make sure you're looking at the fiscal impacts from hazards related events. And a really good way to pull all of this together to get your community to think about what you're doing is through scenario-based planning, which I believe has been part of the, we've given presentations on that in the past. Again, I'm not going to step through all of these in great detail, but point out just a couple of them. Survey and analyze, visualize community-specific coastal risk. A picture is worth 1,000 words. The more that you can find imagery, the kinds of maps and the pictures that Guy and Ethan and Drew have been showing, the more that helps convey to folks what's going on. So visualize, survey your legal authorities, survey your governmental opportunities, look for there are different innovative financing mechanisms out there. Make sure you're coordinating your forward-looking community planning efforts with your emergency preparedness and response plans. They're not the same things, but they need to be coordinated. We need to start thinking about relocation and post-disaster cleanup protocols. The more that we have development that's at high risk that could be taken out in a bad storm, we need to be thinking about how are we going to clean up the mess that leaves behind. And then the last two are really think carefully about what are we trying to optimize, what are we trying to what are our value systems, and how are we going to really think deliberately about the risks we're facing and the trade-offs that we're going to have to deal with, and make sure we revisit them periodically and make sure we talk about them a lot so everybody's understanding what we're up to. Quickly, there are 6. So a lot of the focus I've been paying attention to is on the shoreline, work at the shoreline, and this kind of tension between trying to protect shoreline property, private shoreline property, against the natural dynamics that we've just heard so much about. And there are basically 6 general ways from a policy, legal, planning perspective to address them: attenuate, resist, replenish, accommodate, avoid, and relocate. Attenuate means building things like offshore break walls that try and affect the erosional processes. Resisting means building seawalls. We're going to try and stop the erosional processes at the water's edge. Replenishing might involve beach nourishment, so picking up sand from some off-site source and pulling it onto the beach. Accommodating means we're not going to try and muck up with the natural features so much, but we're going to start elevating structures, accommodate the change that's happening, but try and still develop in ways that make them more resilient. Avoiding is maybe it's time to start requiring more setbacks or prohibiting really expensive permanent development in places that we're pretty sure are going to be underwater in the foreseeable future. And then relocate is the thing that nobody wants to talk about, but it's the idea of maybe the time has come to pick up and start moving back away from the shoreline. Just quickly, the first 2 are really structure-based approaches, and as Ethan and Guy especially started pointing out, they come with some great risks, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Replenishing and accommodating are still engineering solutions. They all have to be permitted. Avoiding and relocating primarily come about through regulation. I can boil those down to 3 basic approaches. One is to resist or armor, basically put in hardened structures. The other is to try and renourish the beach to bring sand back on board. And then the third is to use regulatory approaches, setbacks, and managed retreat. The key point I want to make here is that there is no perfect solution. When you start drawing lines on maps and building structures and deciding we want nature to stop moving underneath us, we've set ourselves up so that there is no perfect solution here. Every solution we're going to deal with has pros, but it also comes with costs. So armoring can slow erosional processes and maybe safeguard buildings and private property, but it's really expensive. It's going to destroy the natural shoreline. It looks more and more, based on the research Ethan and Guy and others are doing, that the beach, at least in some places, may not come back. So we're going to lose our public trust beaches. And ironically, the places we're most likely to lose them is the places that we've armored the most, because those are where the erosional processes are so more extensive. So there's a trade-off there. Nourishing is promising in a lot of ways. It can slow erosional processes. It can safeguard buildings. It's less damaging ecologically. Maybe it largely hinges on what you have on the beach that you're replenishing, but also where you're drawing the sand source. So you have to be careful where you're pulling the sand from and how you're applying it. The downside of nourishment is that it may be short-term. I heard an engineer once say, beach nourishment is like throwing $100 bills out on the beach. You may spend a lot of money to build up a beach and it could be gone in a single storm. It may last for a while, but it'll eventually dissipate. So it's not a permanent solution unless you're prepared to start doing it regularly in response to shoreline dynamics. And then you get into serious equity considerations. Who's paying for that? Who's benefiting from it? What's the balance there really that's going on in terms of the pros and cons? And then also feasibility. Do you have a ready sand source that you can draw from that won't do great damage, more damage from pulling from it? The final solution to set back from the shoreline and maybe relocate when the time comes, that is the best approach for conserving the ecological and natural systems and the natural public trust beaches. It's probably the most cost-effective over the long term, but it comes at cost. It requires moving or losing structures. It can be expensive in the short term to pick up homes and move them or take them out altogether. And it does result in the private shoreline converting to state-owned bottomland again, which is, again, part of a natural process. How do you move from planning? What do you do next? You go to zoning. And so I think I saw John Hodgson is on this call, and David Bunty, both local government officials who are at the front end of addressing these concerns through a regulatory approach that's really designed to account for natural processes. We've had a couple papers published to play out these kinds of approaches and zoning approaches, things to be thinking about as you do your planning. And then finally, I know we're behind time, but just quickly, most recently, I've been working with some legal colleagues and Guy Meadow on the technical side to do a really thorough systematic review of Michigan law as it relates to our shoreline armoring. And the question is, do state and local governments have authorities to regulate shoreline armoring, or how far do those authorities go? And then if they're regulating shoreline development and armoring and lawsuits start to happen, which I think is very likely to be the case in the foreseeable future, how will that litigation likely play itself out? So we stepped through the constitutional provisions that are in place in Michigan, Michigan's public trust doctrine, several state acts that implement those public trust and constitutional provisions, and then local authorities to act. We do have, in Michigan's a little unique, we have a natural resources clause in our constitution that puts upon the burden upon the legislature to take steps to protect the natural environment. We have a very robust public trust doctrine, perhaps one of the strongest of the 8 Great Lakes states, and it's been in place since Michigan became a state. So it's a well-established public trust doctrine that really is a combination of common law, this constitutional law, and then the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act. The 3 state acts that speak to shorelines and submerged bottomlands are the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act, and the Shoreline Protection Management Act. I saw one of the questions in the thing was who owns and protects the submerged bottomlands? The state of Michigan does. Right now, the name changes periodically, but right now it's EGLE. It's the Department for Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. There are sections within EGLE that are the entities that implement the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act, which is the primary act that provides the regulatory authority to regulate placement of things on the submerged bottomlands. And then finally, we stepped through local authorities, police power, and zoning and subdivision. And just to cut to the chase, in terms of whether there is adequate authority, we conclude the state has adequate authority. It might even have a duty to regulate shoreline development and the placement of armoring in a way to ensure that natural shorelines continue to function. It hasn't been litigated yet, so you can never be sure what a court's going to do until the court rules, but there's really robust case law out there that suggests that the courts would recognize a state authority to protect shorelines, if not a duty to do so. And then I'm pretty confident too that local governments, through their police power and their zoning authority, not because of the public trust doctrine, but through their police power and zoning authorities, they have pretty robust a power to regulate to the water's edge for the public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. Okay, what happens if people start suing because things aren't happening on the shoreline in ways they would like to see happen? And there are really 3 places that lawsuits could happen. One would be private or public interest groups suing the state, asserting that the state's not acting robustly enough to protect shorelines from impairment, or the state is not acting robustly enough to protect the submerged bottomlands and the public trust interest in shorelines from conversion to private ownership. And I can talk about that in a minute if that's a little bit confusing, but arguably when you put a seawall in and you fix the boundary of the shoreline and prevent it from naturally converting to submerged bottomland, you've taken a public resource, kind of the inverse of a regulatory taking. And then finally, if the state were to act in response to either of those things or to protect either of those interests, what about how do we make sure now that the government doesn't abuse shoreline property owners through its regulations? What would be the likely outcome of litigation? So citizen suits to compel protection of the environment. What are the protections in place through the laws? All of the state acts and the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act provide statutory protections to prevent us from being abused by government officials. And then the primary constitutional protections that are likely to kick in will be due process claims. You're not treating me fairly, basically, under the law. Equal protection claims. You're treating some people differently from others in a way that's might be found unconstitutional. And then regulatory takings claims, the argument that you've so regulated my property that you've now taken it from me and you should compensate me for that. Our conclusions right now are that I'm pretty confident with these conclusions is that it's not clear if citizens sue to compel the state to do more to protect the environment if they would prevail. I think there's case law on both sides that could support going either way. So it's really unclear how that would play itself out. I think if property owners sue on a due process or equal protection claim, that if they get regulated in a way they're unhappy about because the state or a local government is acting to protect the shoreline, I think the government's probably going to win. I don't think those lawsuits would likely prevail. I think that's probably true for regulatory takings claims as well, at least for per se claims, because of the public trust doctrine. There's this underlying common law, constitutional, statutory law that establishes that there are these natural interests, public interests at play here that would preclude at least a per se regulatory taking. Any one of these cases could be lost by the government, depending on the particular facts of the situation and how well the government justified what it did and how well it treated people across different settings. But I think, so the solution to that, or the big challenge that we're really going to confront is what about all the shorelines that have already been armored? What I'm hearing from the coastal engineers, maybe this will be a good question for them, even those really big hard seawall armaments that are in place are probably eventually going to give way to the lake. Maybe at that point that we start to say you can't replace it. You can have it while it's there. You can't replace it if we want to protect natural shorelines. But recognize if we're going to replace it, there's still going to be this ongoing cost over time to maintain it and the loss of the natural features. How do we get out of this mess? There's going to be no easy solution, no easy answers, but the best thing to do is plan, get the best data available you can, plan, and then be reasonable in your regulations in the way that you treat people. So I had to go really fast because I know a short period of time to be able to talk, lots of ground to cover. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, actually, I think that you did. The questions that I was keeping an eye on for you in the chat, I think that you addressed the question about, who's the state exactly when you say the state. So that was a good one. And then we had a little series of questions, about the impact, right, of your neighboring and upwater armoring, when that affects your property, what is your recourse? What I hear you say, and correct me if I'm characterizing this correctly, is that we're sort of starting to think about this in a new way, and that's why there's not this sort of established case law that, as you've said, nobody has brought this to court yet or whatever. Is that correct?
In the past, people didn't build the kinds of big homes so close to the water's edge that are getting built now, and we didn't have the lake level rising so quickly and the kind of armoring going in that's been installed. You can go up and down the lakes and see evidence of failed armoring structures, but it wasn't as extensive as what we seem to be facing now. And I think we have better science now that's really documenting the losses that we're going to be incurring in the way of the natural features that are going to get lost and all the money that's going to have to get spent on these arming schemes. And so we haven't had the lawsuits yet to really clarify some of these really pointed questions. Lots of litigation. There's been an ongoing case down at St. Joe about the Army Corps' liability for the harbor structure that's there that hasn't been resolved. But these questions about if the state starts to regulate, is that going to create due process claims? Hasn't been regulated. If you build a seawall and there's no longer a natural beach, does that mean people can walk across your seawall because that's where the beach would have been? But for the seawall, I've had people ask me that in webinars, hasn't been litigated yet. So I don't have a good answer. So a lot of our analysis is speculation on where we think the courts would go based on the way they've decided related but not identical cases in the past. given that these questions are still novel. I will say that we don't address it in this article, but there's good case law to think that if you're a neighboring property owner, if your neighbor builds a seawall that demonstrably causes erosion on your property, you might have a good claim against them for nuisance. Nuisance is you have the right to use your property in a way that doesn't harm, but you can't use it in a way that harms your neighbor. Well, if someone's increasing erosion on your property, you might have a good claim of nuisance, but that hasn't been litigated either. So I don't have a good definitive answer on that one.
Well, that's one that that's curious to me. So I'm glad to hear you say that there hasn't been case law. It's not that I just have missed it. I'm going to reach back into the comments a little bit. We just have a couple of minutes for questions. But so Ethan, when you were showing the your data around the harbor, and I'm sorry, was it Saugatuck, South Haven, or behind the harbor?
Yeah.
Question came in, and the question just was, well, what's a harbor to do? I mean, we have a lot of them. Is there a standard best practice? Is that what we're working toward?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you know, guys working on actually working at South Haven and similar areas. And I think it really depends on the harbor itself. And, you know, because some harbors are small, some harbors are larger. Some harbors are located in areas where they're downdrift of a good sediment supply. And so, you know, they may be trapping a lot of sand versus an area where there's a lot of armoring. So I think that's, you know, in large part, what we're trying to do is figure out, like a harbor isn't just a harbor. There's all kinds of different flavors on top of that. And then the geography of that harbor in the adjacent areas matters. And so we're trying to get a better sense of, you know, where the sand is going. You know, Guy's done a lot of work down at, he showed the map in New Buffalo, which is a very different scenario where there's a lot of sand moving really far out. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're going. But we would love to be able to say, hey, if you have this kind of structure, because it's not like you're going to be taking that harbor out. So how are you managing with that? So I love that question of, you know, what do you do given the circumstance that you have? I think that's ultimately where we're trying to go with the body.
If I could add just a little bit to that,
Yeah.
the city of St. Joseph last year was very successful in tagging on with the Corps of Engineer for their maintenance dredging. The Corps of Engineer let the city purchase additional dredging, and then all those dredgings to keep the channel open, it's a commercial harbor, were placed on the beach at St. Joseph. So that's a nice trend to see that the Corps of Engineers is willing to work with states and municipalities to be able to kill two birds with one stone when they're doing maintenance dredging.
Yeah, that coordination seems to be really a key piece of the whole system here. There are a couple more questions, which I'm going to preserve and send them along so that you can help us answer what you can, because we kind of have to move along here. I will say that it looks like a couple of the remaining ones really are kind of along the vein of, well, what do we do about the armoring the structures that have already been built, which I think is a really good question and one that absolutely worries us. I will just say from the perspective of, you know, we're all here because we've been participating in the planning and zoning module of this Coastal Leadership Academy. And so I think I would just kind of bring us around to the idea that actually the most good we can do here are to the next 50 years, right? The problem of the things that we built over the last 50 years that now we need to address in some way, the existing harbor walls, the existing piers, all those things. One thing that the planning and zoning module can be really good about is in 50 years from now, having fewer of those, right? Was there some agreement on that? Is that a correct statement, do you think?
So, yeah, if I could jump in. A good rule of thumb is first do no harm. So we know now that these armoring structures cause lots of damage and harm. And so where they don't exist, we should be thinking hard about not allowing them to come in if you want to preserve the natural features in the shoreline. The second thing about what do you do when armoring structure is already built? So again, you can go up and down the shorelines and see evidence of shoreline armoring structures of the past that have failed. I think, you know, Guy and Ethan, tell me if I'm wrong, but my sense is the really big armoring structures that have been built recently are probably going to fail at some point in the future. It may take a little bit longer and more damage may be done in the process of getting there, but they're probably going to fail. So now is the time to be thinking ahead. What do we do when that happens? Do do we say folks can keep building them and making them bigger and stronger, recognizing that's just going to create more opportunity for them to fail? Or do we start to set up the mechanism to say at some point we're going to finally decide it's time to take them out and live with the natural features that are going on? I don't have the answer to that, but I think communities need to get those hard questions out on the table. And they also need to start talking to EGLE. I think EGLE, frankly, permitted a whole lot of seawalls without realizing what they were doing because it happened so fast, and there wasn't a good coordinated effort to think through the long-term implications and consequences of doing that. And that makes it really hard for local governments that want to protect their beaches if EGLE's permitting anything that comes in. So starting some more dialogue between local governments and the state about what are we doing here, and maybe coordinating efforts to make sure that it's happening in a reasonable way. And I know that I sound like I'm anti-private shoreline property owner, and I'm absolutely not. But I think we've been deferring to this idea that when you own property, you get to do whatever you do to protect it, even if that creates a huge public harm. And I want to get back out on the table. Maybe that's not true. We need to have that discussion and conversation and think about how we balance those competing interests a little bit better.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you for your time this afternoon. This has just been really great, and we very much appreciate your expertise here, and we're sure that we'll be in touch. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to have all of you be at this session today and accessible through the coastal management program. And I'm sure Rhonda agrees that this is the dream team to work with us all. So shifting gears a little bit, one of the goals of the Coastal Leadership Academy was to create a community of practice that can share their learning, share their successes with each other. So that's one reason why you were invited today. We have convened 5 Coastal Leadership Academies, most of them in this past year, but also we had a pilot Coastal Leadership Academy in 2020, and that was in Emmett County. A number of these communities are moving forward with the different approaches, a variety of different approaches based on their action plans or based on conversations that happened after they attended the Coastal Leadership Academy. So we thought today that we'd highlight a couple of these communities, and also if you feel comfortable sharing what's going on in your community, we'd like to welcome that as well. But I will start with Tammy Dornenberg from Emmett County. Tammy was part of the pilot project for the Coastal Leadership Academy and is going to let us know what they're doing in Emmett County.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks for convening this summit. It's great to see everyone back again, and just what great information that everyone brings to the table. In Emmett County, I feel like we haven't really moved forward a lot, but we have started conversations. We have engaged with the hazard mitigation planning, which hasn't been done in Emmett County in the planning and zoning office for probably close to 20 years. So that's something that we are actively involved with now. And that hasn't happened, like I said, in quite some time. So we'll be able to participate with that program. I think that the key is education. This information comes from experts, and that's something that our staff, doesn't have. So having this panel of experts and all of the recordings that have been provided by EGLE just really help us spread the word and get out the information that has been provided through the Leadership Academy. And then one thing we have been able to do is challenge property owners and challenge design professionals when they come in and they say, okay, we need a soil erosion permit and we want to get started on this project right away. We're bringing in, a revetment wall and it has to be done this way because we're losing our shoreline. We're able to actually say, look, there might be other alternatives. We can provide them the links to the information that's available. And I think that's really opened the line of communication with EGLE staff as well. When we see permits come through that are just basically rubber stamping revetment walls, we're just basically asking them to reevaluate their permitting and maybe take a look at it to see if there are other options available that they maybe haven't considered. So I thank you. There's a lot more to do in our community. We know that, but we're taking baby steps toward a more resilient shoreline in Emmett County.
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. And then I should mention that in Emmett County, you had a bluff ordinance in place for many years. And so that is something that some communities might be interested in looking into. Did you, in addition to the hazard mitigation plan, were there any other actions that you took, ordinance changes or permitting changes within your office as a result?
We actually did deny a permit application that came in a critical dune area as a result of the training that we had received through the Coastal Leadership Academy. As far as actual changes to our ordinance, not in our ordinance, but we did add a chapter to our master plan.
Okay.
Complete chapter on resiliency. And so that was the first step. And our next step will be looking at the ordinance and seeing what we can do to modify. We do have a 60-foot setback from the all-time high water mark. So far we haven't hit that high water mark from 1986 in Emmett County. So we're fortunate that we don't use the fluctuating water line as our setback line. I think that was key, and that was done, well, probably shortly after the 80s, but that's been in place for a long time. So we don't see as much erosion where we're losing structures as a result of that, but we have lost infrastructure in Emmett County for sure as a result of shoreline erosion.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. Next up, we have Julie Cowrie from Casco Township along the Lake Michigan shoreline. So Julie, you want to share what you've been doing in your area?
Sure, and I want to give a shout out to two of our Casco people who are also on this call, Sandra and Lois, so thanks for being here. Our board formed a Casco erosion committee that then coincided with the Coastal Leadership Academy that was offered in our area. So it was like this 1-2 punch to address the very dramatic erosion we experience because we have high clay bluffs. And we also have a growth of revetments, and we had a lot of concern about that. So I'm going to run through about 6 things that occurred. So we had the committee, and after both the committee finished its work as well, its learning, and the Coastal Leadership Academy, which was a wonderful opportunity to continue our learning, we made a report and some recommendations to the board. And included among those recommendations were to follow guidelines that we already have in place around, like don't let people build closer to the bluff than what we currently have as setbacks would be an obvious one. We also met with the Planning Commission, and we drafted language that we wanted to have added to the master plan to more forthrightly discuss our shoreline and its importance to our community. So they have taken that under consideration, and they're about to do text amendments to the master plan. At the board level, the board expressed interest in developing a resolution to address the current EGLE permitting process. And I think Dr. Norton mentioned this in his remarks, but what we learned was the current permitting process has some real flaws, right? I mean, the township may or may not even get a chance to chime in on revetments that are being permitted. And so we would like to have a discussion, and we are using the clout of the board to start that discussion. And moreover, we are part of a newly drawn state district that is comprised just of shoreline townships, stretching from Saugatuck to the state border. And so once we have our new rep elected, we'll be looking to that rep to represent our concerns through this resolution that addresses the current EGLE permitting process, and hopefully will stimulate some change, or at least a good examination of that process. We started a Facebook page as a way to sort of communicate with each other and collect information that's helpful. We felt this was a little easier than trying to put things on the township website, which was kind of a step beyond our control. I attended the recent meeting in Gaylord that was open to people from EGLE and NOAA, and it was just a wonderful day to learn more about shoreline erosion or constructive things to do, a good discussion on drainage. And finally, we are working on a grant application to address restoring public access to our Casco Township Nature Preserve, which has experienced profound erosion, and we're responding to the state high water infrastructure grant program. So really the Coastal Leadership Academy helped us be prepared for this grant opportunity. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, that I'm sure it feels great to the coastal management program to hear that was really the impetus to get the Coastal Leadership Academy up and running. So that's great, Julie. And I find it interesting that you have opted to go to social media. We heard at the Northeast Coastal Leadership Academy that social media actually could be an obstacle in their area. So just trying to find what is that balance where you're getting information out to the community that's respected, that people will find to be helpful. So we wish you luck in that. Great. Well, thank you. We'll give an opportunity now for Linda Farrell. Linda is with the city of Frankfort, again, on the Lake Michigan side.
Hi, everybody. This has been really interesting to be here today and to get updates and learn a little bit more. So our group has met, we have an informal group that's been meeting, Carolyn Thayer, Jeff Smith, Brady Olson, and myself for a couple of times. We're still in the early stages of getting organized, but our planning commission meets tonight, and on the agenda is for them to create a formal coastal resiliency subcommittee. So hopefully that happens. And then we have a meeting scheduled next week, and Josh Mills, our city supervisor, will be joining us as we meet formally. We hope then to prioritize our work and establish some regular meeting times. Some of the topics that we've identified to work on so far are reviewing, listing, and taking an accounting of past, current, and future projects in Frankfort, reviewing our zoning as it applies to coastal resiliency, including building zoning for storm runoff. So it's a couple of things. We want to ask about water testing at the source of the entry of our stormwater into our bay, into Betsy Bay, find out what's going into the bay and see if that needs to be mitigated. Identifying other organizations and individuals in our area that would be interested, and we've done a little bit of outreach to that. And there's a woman in Lake Leelanau that Brady has identified, and maybe Brady, if you want to, you can say a little more about her. Hopefully, she will be joining us. We've been looking. This is my job and I haven't done it yet, looking into the possibility of cisterns to catch rainwater, both at our two schools and off of City Hall. We're a tree city, and we have a lot of watering needs in the city and at the school too. And so if we could catch that rainwater instead of using city water, use that to go around and water all of our trees. That would be a very useful thing. Maybe have the city sponsor a rain barrel program. We're just looking at that, seeing if we can get people to put rain barrels up and use the rainwater, of course, to water their own yards and gardens. So also we're having a new information kiosk in the city is going to be put up. It hasn't gone up yet, but for people to get all kinds of information in town about the beach and where the bathrooms are and all kinds of where to eat in town, and perhaps adding information about coastal resiliency to the kiosk, just to help people understand what we're about and how we're trying to protect our beach and our shoreline. And then I hope that we will be considering an application for the EGLE grant for 2024. Start to look at that at our next meeting next week. And we just know we have a lot to do, but we are trying to get organized and get going. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Linda. The focus in Frankfurt is a little bit, it sounds like more on water quality, perhaps, than in some other areas, but certainly, you know, stormwater, green infrastructure was something that was discussed a lot at that session.
Right. Well, that's true. I mean, we have had a lot of stuff, but we kind of think that that's one way to get citizens just involved in understanding that we're, you know, we need to protect our water as well as the shorelines, and just kind of just start to open people's eyes to, you know, that we exist, this coastal resiliency, and some of the things that we can do.
That's great. Well, I wish we could ask for more input, but if you think of things, or if you have other successes to share with us, drop them into the chat. You'll also have an opportunity. We're going to send you a quickie evaluation form at the end of this Zoom meeting that you can add as well, because we're really interested in finding out what you've been up to and what you found to be successes and obstacles to your work following the Coastal Leadership Academy. So thank you very much to Tammy, Julie, and Linda for sharing your information. And with that, I know a couple of you talked about the EGLE grant opportunities. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Latosky from the Coastal Management Program, who's going to close us out with some information about those grant opportunities. So Melissa.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Let me go ahead and get everything pulled up. Does that look okay?
Looks great.
Great. So my name is Melissa Latosky. I am the Coastal Waters Coordinator within the Michigan Coastal Management Program, and I'm going to be sharing some information on funding opportunities we have available for you all. Our first funding opportunity is our annual funding opportunity for planning and low-cost construction grants. We are currently accepting applications for our 2024 grant cycle, and we have about $700,000 available, with applications being due to us by December 16th. Awards will begin in October of 2023, with grantees having up to 15 months to complete their projects. Planning grants can be no greater than $100,000, and low-cost construction grants can be no greater than $200,000. For this funding, we do require one-to-one non-federal match, and match can be in the form of cash, in-kind services, or donations. Applicants for this funding can be local units of government, regional planning agencies, educational institutions, tribal government, state agencies, and our nonprofit organizations. Activities eligible for this funding include planning and construction projects related to our program's 5 focus areas, which are hazards, habitat, community development, waters, and public access. We did host 2 webinars covering application and funding requirements for this opportunity. One was just a general overview webinar, and the other did cover our low-cost construction grants. Both of those recordings are posted on our website, so you can go and check those out if you're interested. Next is our 2023 Creating a Culture of Resilience Capacity Building Funding Opportunity. We are currently accepting applications for this funding opportunity, and we have about $1 million available, with applications being due to us on November 30th. Capacity grants can be up to $100,000 and will require one-to-one non-federal match. We're expecting these grants to begin as early as April of 2023, with grantees having up to 15 months to complete their projects. Eligible applicants for this funding include our watershed councils, planning agencies, the 10 regional council of governments, and the 41 county planning departments that serve our coastal communities. This funding is intended to help fill the gap within organizations that can happen when you have limited staffing, capacity, hours, and budgets. It's targeted at building capacity within the eligible organizations to focus your efforts on increasing awareness of coastal hazards and building resilience via outreach, technical assistance, and trainings. Next, we have the 2023 State High Water Infrastructure Funding. This is one-time funding that was passed by the legislature. It created a $14.25 million grant program for infrastructure and planning grants that directly address the impacts presented by severe weather events, with a focus on projects that address flooding, erosion, urban heat, and stormwater management. Grants are capped at $1.5 million and require 20% non-federal match. And we're currently accepting applications for this funding through November 30th. We're expecting awards to begin in April of 2023, and grantees will have until September of 2026 to complete their projects. Eligible applicants for this funding include our Regional Council of Governments and our local units of government. Activities eligible include the development of local or regional resiliency plans, updating local master plans to consider high water levels, climate and storm resiliency, and coastal hazards, the planning and implementation of nature-based solutions or green infrastructure projects, relocation or protection of critical infrastructure like our roads, our water lines, or sewer lines, and the development or implementation of climate resiliency or habitat restoration projects. So next we have our NOAA infrastructure funding. This funding is available through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which allocated $207 million to NOAA for habitat restoration and land conservation projects. This funding is available to coastal state programs like the Michigan Coastal Management Program through a competition among the states. Every year that this funding is available, each state's coastal program can submit up to 3 letters of interest for NOAA's consideration. NOAA will release 2 funding opportunities, one in 2023 and one in 2024. Our program will be releasing requests for proposals to coincide with that timeline to seek out projects that we can submit to NOAA as letters of interest. I do want to emphasize the competition aspect of this funding. We are expecting it to be highly competitive. This could mean that only one or even potentially none of our letters of interest get selected by NOAA. And part of that competitive nature is due to the amount of funding available. Projects can be up to $6 million with no matching funds required. And then projects would have up to 3 years to be completed, since this funding can cover projects of a larger scale. NOAA has placed emphasis on funding ready-to-go projects. That means projects that are construction ready with plans that are up to 90% complete. If selected, funding would be allocated to our program, and we would pass through those funds to either local units of government, cities, counties, villages, state agencies, or tribal governments. And eligible activities include habitat restoration. So that is on the ground implementation of habitat restoration projects, planning, engineering, and design of habitat restoration projects, and land acquisition. And land acquisition is for the purpose of long-term protection, not for the purpose of creating parks. NOAA has not released any dates for when to expect the funding opportunity for 2023, but our program intends to release our funding opportunity soon to seek out projects. Information is going to be posted on our website once that opportunity is available. And you can always reach out to me before then if you have any questions. Lastly, I want to share some information on vulnerability risk assessments available through the Land Information Access Association's Resilient Michigan. This is a mini grant program that is available to assist coastal communities with completing vulnerability and sustainability assessments. These assessments are part of your pathway to resilience. It is your second step on the pathway. The assessments support community planning efforts that lead to the adoption of resilient plans and policies. And then if you're interested, more information on these assessments can be found at resilientmichigan.org. And then I want to wrap things up with the Coastal Management Program team. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions on any of the funding opportunities that I spoke on. And then you can find more information on the funding opportunities and then the applications for the funding opportunities on our website, michigan.gov/coastal management. And I'm not sure if I have time for questions, but if I do, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks, Melissa. I think if there are questions about the funding opportunities, we might as well take them now. I put the link to the Coastal Management Program website in the chat. Let's see, Pablo just asked, can you go back to the contact slide? Melissa, can you repost those so people have that on their screen?
Let's see.
There you go.
There we go.
There you go. Great. Any questions for Melissa about funding? I know we're at our time, but we're happy to answer any of those. You also now have their email addresses if you want to reach out. I know, Melissa, you are going to be a contact on many of the grants. Did you want to talk about who was doing what grant or who's going to be the contact for what grant?
Oh, sure. So for the annual funding opportunity, feel free to reach out to any of our coordinators. For the capacity building funding opportunity, you can reach out to myself or Adam Arend. For the state high water funding opportunity, you can reach out to Emily Kirkpatrick. And then for the NOAA infrastructure funding, you can also reach out to me for that one.
Great. Thank you. Looks like we are at the end of our program. I don't know if you or Rhonda want to say anything, but it's been great to have you all together again. It's good to see your faces and glad to hear that you're doing things in your communities. And we hope that you keep on doing the good work. Anything else from the Coastal Management Program?
I'll just end with thanking everyone again for your time this afternoon. And again, we feel that we're very graced to have you on this journey with us, and you'll be hearing more. We will be launching a nature-based solutions module in 2023, mimicking the NOAA Digital Coast module, but targeting it for actual Michigan type of practices and adaptation strategies. So that's coming. And we are also developing our feasibility alternatives toolkit. So more to come on the horizon. And we just, again, thank you for spending your time, and you'll be hearing from us through our accumulation of email addresses. So thank you so much. And thank you, Wendy and Leah, for hosting us today.
Great. All right, everyone have a great afternoon. Bye now.